And I'm delighted to be with you today. So, just to recap, in session one, we covered from compliance to performance, the context for change. So, why this transition to performance-based design is essential and how it aligns with evolving EU policy, national climate goals, and investment priorities. So, that's session one. Session two, we looked at embedding performance in design, principles in action. So this was discussing practical strategies to set targets, track performance, and verify results. And we had some amazing case studies last week. So this is a final session, and with this, we're going to explore the importance of cross-disciplinary collaboration for project delivery of performance targets. We'll be hearing from two leading professionals. So we're going international today. We're taking international perspectives on practice readiness and established methodologies to to verify project outcomes. So we'll begin with a more detailed exploration of collaborative approaches, followed by real life examples of POE. Review assessment methods and deliver on building performance. And we'll conclude with a panel discussion on our next steps. And you'll see the short agenda on the screen. So the panel discussions will invite three people from IGBC, from SEAI, and from RIAI, and we'll have a high-end discussion. In all these cases, please put in your questions into the Q&A, and I'll pick up as many as I can, so we can ask Ann-Marie, who's our first speaker, then Nellie, and then in the panel discussion. So please be active in the Q&A, as you have done in the previous sessions. So the mainstream design for performance in Ireland, that's what we're going to be looking at. And there will be time for discussion and reflection for Q&A, and there's going to be some live polling. So live polling will give Ann-Marie a little bit of a break in between her two presentations, and we'll do a live poll then. And then in the afternoon, after the comfort break, Nellie will be coming in, and then we'll be having a discussion panel. And you'll see the listing there. So I'll go through that after the comfort break anyway, of what we're doing in the afternoon, closing breaks, etc. Okay, so I think, Marie, if you're ready, we may start with your presentation, but I'll introduce you first, I think. So Ann-Marie Fallon, she'll be doing a topic on procurement and contracts, delivering the design performance. Now, Ann-Marie is an award-winning architect and certified passive house designer with expertise in estate decarbonisation and low-energy building design. She has led several of UK's pioneering passive house projects across residential and educational sectors, and recently developed a groundbreaking methodology for decarbonising large public estates. As well as being a board member of the BEST and a trainer with Coaction CIC, Ann-Marie is a passionate advocate for research and practice and teaches environmental design at the University of Bath. So Ann-Marie, we'll let you take over.
Yeah. Just a very brief introduction then to Archetype. Thank you, Elizabeth, for the introduction to me. Low pressure to be very on form for this morning. We have 3 studios across the UK. The most recent studio has been the development of our practice in Edinburgh, mainly in the last 5 years in response to Scotland's ambitious climate policies and how they've set that across their public sector and private sector. We specialise in passive house. We have 40 years of design data, and in the last 15 years or so, that focus has really been driven by having passive house as our primary performance target for our buildings, and about 95% of our projects in terms of KPI are passive house or towards EnerPhit passive house in terms of performance metrics. So these are just the headings that I wanted to bring us through this morning around execution and delivery through contracts and procurement. So I'm not going to be quoting specific letters and numbers from clauses, but it's more about the practical application and trying to give you the tools and tips to learn the lessons that we have, and with plenty of project examples and section examples of bringing us through delivery. So delivering on building performance is definitely not a new topic. I know it may feel like this because of the kind of changes and the legislation that's coming through, which is very positive, but building performance and the failures or successes, but mainly failures of building performance, has been something that's been really widely reported on in the last couple of years. And it's not just about energy metrics, it's comfort and health and building compliance. And we can see from the Hackett and Cole reports and various UK specific literature in this context, where that's been picked up and failures, whether it's retrofit or within new build, have been documented. And essentially it is about performance underneath all of those reports reporting failures. The Zero Carbon Hub produced a report in the UK way back in 2014, which feels comical actually that now we're 11 years on and most of the same issues still exist within our construction industry. I won't go into detail on all the actions here, but it's a really, really useful report and scene setting, and it goes through several different topics that we will mention and run through today in terms of practical application. And interestingly, the areas that they prioritised in 2014 for research, there has been research, there is evidence of better building, better performance, better workflows now, but we're still seeing a lack of execution of that, of course, on the kind of delivery side. So, do performance metrics affect tendering? I'm sure in the big group that's listening this morning, there's going to be a variety of opinions and probably experiences of that. I'm going to be a bit controversial with mine. So this is a photo of the first block of one of the largest high density residential passive house developments in the UK, Agar Grove in London, for London Borough of Camden, and we'll come back to that in a moment. And I guess two key questions for me are these two that I'll thread through the rest of the presentation. You know, how a building is tendered, does that affect its performance? And how does having a performance-driven design and tender affect project delivery? I don't believe the tender procurement route doesn't necessarily affects performance in a negative way. The quality of the information of what we put together for that tender and how informed and collaborative we are ultimately is going to impact how that building performs. The answer to the second question, then, it's also a positive one, which might sound quite controversial, but having performance-driven design at the center of your brief and creating that certainty as a client and as a consultant team gives confidence to the contractor and gives confidence to the execution element of the projects. And I believe you would have seen some examples of that in the last session. Of course, this is an ideal world. There are challenges, and we'll run through some of those. And just coming back to Agar Grove here, I guess what's really interesting is, you know, yes, you'll have the projects that are delivered and occupied, but behind the skin of those projects, this particular facade, the south facade on this block, had 7 to 8 subcontractors coordinating between the facade line, which is the thermal line, and the walkway, which was the kind of amenity area for balconies and terraces. There was lots of panel sign-off protocols per level. There was thermal and fire performance continuity mapped across the project as well. This project was developed through COVID, Japanese knotweed, Grenville, a lot of kind of contractual issues thrown at the project as well as the performance targets. And other elements of high performing buildings like the air tightness layer here and windows, etc., all build into that complexity of delivery and execution. So straight into really, how can the client and design team create that great platform for then the contractor to come along and deliver on his obligations and responsibilities? It might sound very obvious, and this might touch on some elements from the last session, but trying to make the energy target really explicit in all the client documentation. Where we find building performance fails and building targets fail in contracts and tenders and procurement is when the documentation is either not fully committed or there's an element of something referenced about energy in one place and it's not really followed through comprehensively through the rest of the documentation. And you know, again, projects individually deal with lots of different complexity. So we have our Passive House Secondary School here, Harris Academy in Sutton, where we had a lot of constraint around the site. But we also had very ambitious goals from the client in terms of One Planet Sutton wanting to drive down energy demand in the building, as well as embodied carbon. So the project had an embodied carbon focus as well. And we were able to respond to all of those things on quite a difficult sloping site because the client was quite an informed client who understood what brief they're setting and how they were going to achieve that. So in the multiplicity of certification and energy targets that we can set out there, they went for 2 or 3 singular simple targets, and we were able to very easily respond to that with an inexperienced contractor and also rest of the design team that hadn't delivered to this level before. And it was our first secondary school at that scale as well, about 8 and 9 years ago. So it was quite novel for all of us, but the client was so important in making sure that we were able to move forward with certainty. Another area that's, I guess, really important is around consultant appointment. And, we're in an infancy of where we're designing, performance of buildings, and the kind of framework that SAI and URI I've set out is there to help and handhold through that process. But we can deliver these complex buildings with teams that have not done it before. We've delivered many buildings with tier one contractors that have never done it before. It is all around the right approach and attitude and getting set up in the right way. And really, having a willingness to look across discipline and understand how M&E services engineers aren't just a tick the box service that come in at the end of the architect's design. They're actually there to iteratively design your facade for you, for example. And look at how we're dealing with ventilation and comfort in the building. That is something that as architects we need to engage with, and they need to also be able to step in on. And the image on the right is the plant room for this building. So it was pre-decarbonisation. So there's two gas boilers in the building. It's a 10,500 metre squared project. Two 140 kilowatt boilers. One is the reserve boiler, and the other boiler is doing the hot heating and hot water for the rest of the building. So again, there was a little bit of disbelief, and we were looking for less redundancy in that second boiler. So, could that boiler have been smaller? Because we were very confident they wouldn't need it. But of course, it's there for a backup function as well. But we, again, evidencing the very small energy demand in these buildings once we get the performance targets right. The client can also influence the tender process. So making sure that when we're setting a tender and going out for procurement, that it's not just the standard documentation you're getting from your project manager with maybe just an extra line that says I'm aiming for the RAI climate targets, or I'm aiming for passive house, or a certain target in embodied carbon. You can really focus on asking quality driven questions, focus on the previous experience that show process and quality. And we've started working with clients around scenario based responses, so trying to draw in case studies and, more importantly, evidence. And how that's developed with clients in Scotland is now the tier one contractors there actually have evidence of several large scale buildings that delivered to various Scottish or passive house energy targets. And those scenario based hypothetical questions are now coming through the tender process as hard evidence, with the performance data actually driving how successful they are or not. And that's coming across in how we're assessing tenders. And then getting to know people within that process and how they will manage, and their attitudes to how that works, those working processes are managed as well, is really important. The elephant in the room, or the thing that people don't like addressing, and I'm putting myself out here and suggesting something, and by no means it's kind of a UK context, and Ireland may be quite different. Is the team going to cost you more? You're putting this process together, you're setting this really ambitious brief as a client. You're worried about the contract cost being expensive, but you're also worried about how much extra is this cost to me in terms of consultants and specialists and trying to get to these targets. And we are in a novel point in the industry where we don't have that blanket knowledge or baseline knowledge across everywhere, even though the resources and tools are very much ready and available, like this series session as well. We are seeing that because we're being asked to deliver better on quality, even on a consultant level, that our scopes, because of the way the industry is and the way prices are generally run to cost percentage weighting being more of a priority, that we aren't delivering service, we aren't delivering that enhanced quality or provision for delivering quality within our baseline scopes. So we're often seeing this add-on percentage, whether that's within a singular lump sum or whether that's a separate individualized scope that's set beside the rest of the project. And in my experience, which is just, one person in the UK, but generally delivering projects like this all the time, we're seeing a kind of 0.5 to 5% contingency on all consultants' fees in feedback from major clients, particularly in the public sector. And of course, there's projects then where it is being lumped in with our normal fees and our normal percentages. And that's where there can be issues, because your whole design team needs to buy into knowing that they need to deliver. So an example of that would be an M&E engineer who's just coming in to do compliance checking, coming in to design after the architects completed out their design, with very little collaboration or feedback from the M&E engineer. And there's a lack of iteration of they don't have it in their scope. There's a lack of iteration of really engaging in the design and maybe moving through 3 or 4 design scenarios in detail before the project is signed off at certain work stages. So being accommodating, having that in your back pocket as part of your overall budget planning for a client, make sure there's no surprises, and you're informed about the complexity and scale and how much that percentage might affect you. And again, we're talking about consultant fees, not the overall project cost. That said, having those contingencies, knowing what you're asking for, the clients are so important in relation to the contractual relationship when it gets to site. And I've seen clients where they've just entrenched themselves back in the business as usual historic position, which is the contractor is going to be very nasty through this process and we need to protect ourselves and we're going to not really collaborate or engage. Whilst maybe the start of the project started out very well. And the best projects that we've been on, whether they've delivered on energy targets, but of course the relationship with the client can be very different across those different project types, is a client who has that openness and allows that contract to stay in the filing cabinet a little bit longer. And that does generate generally, depending on the attitude of the contractor, which you should know through a very good tender and vetting process, how you might be able to best manage risk or intervention or variation collaboratively. So just trying to keep the goals clear and keep that openness going as much as possible. Some clients and potentially design teams helping clients put information together can be a bit nervous of like committing to too much technical information in the tender. The more the better, getting in information about how you might imagine sequencing happening, air testing, the expectation around mock-ups. Equally, these are things you might score or mark in a tender process when contractors come back to you with a return on tender. Making sure, again, they might not have delivered passive house, but maybe they delivered the labs in a STEM context somewhere. So they know about quality assurance within a different type of approach, and that you're able to feed that information through. And again, rather than looking at it that the contractor is going to charge you 20% extra because you've given all this information, look at it that you've created a certain amount of certainty in requirements and output, and that you're expecting that quality to follow through. Having evidence requirements, collating them, really reinforcing that cyclical approach, just a little diagram here showing that, allows that process to become a lot more collaborative and cyclical. And, the start of every project does need to be generated from that in-use and 360 review that we generally have at the start of projects before we move on to the next stages, and trying to involve the whole design team in that and client team is really important. And finally, for a client, locking and building performance evaluation. We'll talk about this more in the next session, but it's really powerful, and we can see the Scottish Futures Trust in Scotland have connected energy performance measures and targets with outcomes-based funding. So they don't get the capital funding for their schools anymore up front. They get it over a 25-year period where the buildings have to perform to certain energy and other funding metrics. And post-occupancy evaluation is locked into that. So clients must provide that as part of drawing down that funding. So again, we'll just seeing those clear mechanisms and bringing that in so that buildings are going to perform as designed by year 2. So just a bit of a summary. We've talked about explicit targets, trying to have an informed client, and that can be very difficult. Sometimes we can be very lucky with really informed clients who know how they're spending their private or public sector money. And other times we're dealing with people that just are a little bit remote from the technicality of the process. And really, I feel it's a duty, especially at this early infancy of driving through this change, is that we really try and engage, collaborate, educate, bring people to sites, bring clients along and try and get that engagement, and it will really help for that collaboration piece the whole way through the project. The design team. So coming back again to scope of services. So, with the client to set their information up as best they can, how are you responding to that? And I guess, it's a topic architects, I guess, debate quite a bit, is how we present and replicate information, and I guess the cost and time for that, and how we contractually become implied within what we're showing at different work stages. And this is just an example on the right hand side of a project where there was a change in structure. We delivered a stage 4. It's a novated delivery project, so we delivered a set of technical detailing that satisfied the contractor's VE proposals. But when it came to it, when we started kind of looking at working through it in 3D, it became a lot more complex, and there was a lot more thermal bridging, and there was a lot more sequencing in terms of where the air tightness line sat and the structure sat, that because it became this rushed VE through the project, wasn't thought through consistently enough at the earlier stages. So whilst it did deliver on its thermal performance, we had a little bit of tolerance within the design for that. I think it was just a good example of being able to engage in something where you need to have more collaboration with the design team earlier on, even within a D&B context where, you know, you're on the delivery side and now the contractors come with the proposal. Maybe if we had maybe engaged in some modeling a bit earlier on, or we're able to do some 3D mock-ups in digitally to demonstrate the complexity on site. And if we had the right people around the table, which at this particular point we didn't, it could have made an impact. So again, just that kind of disruption, being really clear on what we're actually providing at different stages. So that extra thermal modeling, for example, wasn't in our scope at the time, but with our Passive House designer scope, if that had been sorted at this project a decade ago, maybe that could have been drawn on in a more collaborative way. Design team as well as the client, when we're working on these projects in the very beginning, and you know there's many consultancies and different experts across Ireland now, in particular because of NZEB and the Part L regulations being slightly ahead of the UK in a lot of instances, where there is experience within the fields that we're working in. So even if, you know, as an architecture practice or consultant practice, you don't feel you have the experience in-house, for those first few projects, look at it as a bit of an investment to try and bring in and develop relationships with some of those consultants. And this is just an example here of how that expertise, once it comes to whether it's integrated or not, can affect how you're delivering buildings. We have two forms here from the Eggar Grove development, and I'm sure you can guess which one's going to be more expensive to build, which one has more embodied carbon, and which one has a lot more details for us to contractually manage through a construction process as a design team over the other. So just in case it's not obvious, it's block A, where the form factor is 1.6. So really trying to think about, you know, from the very first beginnings, don't just get a consultant in to do a tick the box exercise. Bring these designers, bring environmental designers in as early as possible, or develop them in-house to ensure that you're making the right early stage decisions that don't allow for these impacts later. I'm just showing this in terms of free information available. I was with Joseph Little Architects many, many years ago now, and just as a performance target around retrofit was developing with the Passive House Institute, we maybe naively committed with this client to delivering that developing performance standard as it was evolving out of Germany at the time, the ENERFIT, Passive House ENERFIT standard. So this is Ireland's first ENERFIT project in Monkstown, County Dublin. I was a Part 2 assistant with no real qualifications in any of this at all, only a little bit of Passive House designer learning, but not any experience of execution. And with a collaborative approach with the contractor, a really understanding client, and a bit of a journey on airtightness, we actually got there in the end. So I think making sure that, you know, you have confidence within your teams, and perhaps the younger, more junior people in your teams having the knowledge, if you have the experience, to bring them through the process that they may not have been, you know, as exposed to earlier on. It's absolutely not a barrier, and there's since 2011, 2012, there's so much more information online, and the curriculums are changing. I can see in the UK moving towards more energy conscious building physics undergraduate curriculums, particularly in architecture. So, you know, that kind of 2010, 2011 Part 2 assistant architectural graduate is a lot more informed now. So just to summarize, being really clear on the scope of services, looking for that experience to kind of complement your experience, and trying to avail of the training and learning that out there, I think is a really good first basis. And we can talk about some of the technicalities of how that runs through in quality and contractor sections. So just taking quality as a separate section here against just that general kind of ramping up and kind of knowledge around execution. Again, I can't repeat it enough, trying to be explicit, making sure explicit on energy targets. So the image on the right-hand side is the really ambitious brief that we were set by University of Cambridge for the Utopia building, which is the biggest, largest Passive House ENERFIT project in the UK. Again, novel project, inexperienced contractor, mostly inexperienced design team. Lots of really ambitious energy targets. So, you know, did feel a bit tick the box with WELL, with BREEAM, with Passive House, and all of the other bio-based and low embodied carbon targets the building had as well, and reuse and circular economy. So it was a very ambitious brief, but really understanding where the brief was and who had primary responsibility for the different elements of the brief in a collaborative way was you know, the success of that project really. And there's lots of information. University of Cambridge have open source lessons learned on costs, on the sequencing of this project, and how the teams collaborated all online. I'll try and pop it in. I'm sorry I don't have it in this slide at the end of the presentation. And then setting up kind of aspiration or sprint workshops, we call them, where everyone gets around the table. And again, it's not a tick the box workshop exercise. It's a real kind of call to arms and a mandate to understand the level of detail and quality we want on the project, looking at examples, going on site visits, bringing everybody along the path. And I think and kind of winning over hearts and minds is really important in order to deliver that really good information. Jumping into the detail here, we need to be able to really create clarity in our drawings and, contractual clarity as well as the delivery of the particular targets and really addressing, robustness. And I mean, our drawings might not be what some architects think are as a magazine aesthetic. They're very diagrammatic, they're colorful, they're really, I hope they're really actually quite clear. They need to be clear because when someone gets to site, they need to really quickly understand where their layers are. And we also, even very early at REBA stage 2 or 3, actually start highlighting areas they need to be considering for quality. And I think it's a really good idea to either have a little axonometric or you have a little explainer, or there's something within the drawings where you're highlighting some extra detail that you need to deliver that performance target. Sequencing. Again, I've had a debate with architects in the UK. If you can't draw detail in 3D, or your team can't, how can you expect the contractor to build it? And whilst, in a D&B context, we're handing over that responsibility to the contractor, having a set of sequencing drawings is a really collaborative way of approaching their supply chain with the main contractor and saying, right, we think this is going together like that. Here's our drawing, our detailed drawing. What do we think? Whose responsibility are the different layers? And actually, is there a better way of doing it? Because sometimes that can come back from the supply chain and it can save cost and time. And I'm not saying radically change the intent of the detail. The strategy remains the same, but there might be a sequencing change that facilitates everybody on site. And also with our MBS, we have a specific passive house or particular energy target prelim set within that MBS that's referred to and coded on our drawings, within the world of kind of BIM and information management, that allows everything to be coordinated and tagged across, so that there's no excuse for any package to be procured by the main contractor that their supply chain is not aware, that their supply chain is always going to be where the passive house or a similar energy target is required on the project. So explicit targets, bringing people along in a series of workshops, setting that charter around quality of information and who's showing what. Designing with services in mind, we'll come back to services as we go through, and how we interpret and deliver on information is really important, and how much we actually show it. And in the public sector in Scotland in particular, BIM level 2 is an absolute mandate across all projects, and it's quite developed and evolved with the consultants. So it's quite an interesting area to work in terms of how we then deliver right through to kind of COBE targets, etc. On our energy information. And something that I just find can be lacking within all consultants, especially when they're very busy in a very buoyant market like Ireland at the moment, is building in QA time and making sure that we're actually looking at other consultants' information and questioning it and making sure it genuinely is not just coordinated from a spatial point of view, but from a performance point of view, and really liaising with your energy consultant around that. So I just have 2 quotes, one from a report and one controversial one from a contractor, and it depends sometimes on the day whether I agree with them or not. So I'm not saying this is true for everybody, but tier 1 contractor, the responsibility of a successfully delivered high performance building is 80% the design team and 20% the contractor. After delivering several passive house projects with several different consultant teams and clients. And I guess as an architect, I'm a bit upset at that. Of course, I'd like that percentage to be weighted a bit more towards the contractor. But I do really believe, actually, if we can give the foundations as the design and client team for clear information, really clear targets, really informed collaborative working relationships, that the contractor is really just executing what is a really good pack of information, and quality and execution should be his remit in terms of how good that workmanship is. But we know the balance can be very different, and sometimes the design team maybe isn't quite at the grade A level of delivery or experience, and the contractor is taking on that little bit more kind of risk in the building information. And I think we'll find that as we move through the first major projects, and moving forward towards 2030, that we're going to have to develop that relationship to better understand what that contractor needs and what, of course, you're being paid or scoped or being assured to deliver. And of course, they're quite important topics. again, I'm not pulling out the Hackett report here, but the Cole report on school quality or public sector building quality in Scotland. The irrefutable evidence that a third-party certification of construction is really critical to reinforce quality. We've seen that follow through now with the health and safety regulator in the UK with the Higher Risk Buildings Building Safety Act. Obviously, Ireland were a little bit ahead with its building control compared to the UK several years ago as well, from 2010. So we're seeing the impacts of that come through now on a performance-focused basis. And in Scotland at the moment, they're looking at a passive house equivalency for domestic and non-domestic buildings to be rolled out by 2028 within their building regulations. And that the idea of certification is something that their building standards are trying to work through. How can the building control teams take on some of that performance-driven assessment alongside their other requirements? So the few things I'll talk about through this period is the what contractors can be considering. And again, this is lessons learned and feedback from contractors. So I have to credit them rather than just me in this section, their experience, their feedback, what they think we need to be doing to allow them and the team to deliver a successful project. So having that pre-con bid stage. So again, maybe a contractor comes in later in the project, when the design is very developed. The case study I'll go through today is when they come in actually a lot earlier. And again, I know typically traditionally architects balk at that a little bit and think, oh gosh, well, we don't want the architect interfering with our design too early. But I believe to move forward on, data-driven, performance-driven design, engagement is really good, at any stage, particularly early stage. So if you have a contractor in early, and even if they've come in at detailed design stage, they need to be really preparing well on that pre-con stage for reviewing drawings, not just having a commercial view of what they're looking at, but really having their own internal support on energy requirements. And again, having that really well set out information, clearly delivering energy performance targets helps and assists them in that pre-con stage. They also need to really manage who they're employing and training for standing over those quality areas. So whether it's a quality champion, passive house champion, air tightness champion, all these different people that can sit within the contractor team, their upskilling for that and recognition of that, depending on the project scale, is really important. And if there is certifier or verifier engagement, who that is, do they understand the process, and allowing that pre-start on site time for extra design approvals. So their pre-start program should be a little bit longer, especially on the first few projects they deliver, to allow for time to make sure we get that certainty, especially with subcontractor design. It's important that they can influence early design decisions where possible. So again, this is an example of one of our projects where we were doing the first steel frame project to passive house standards in the UK, and the detail around the windows changed slightly because we had a thermal bridge requirement. We also have a fire continuity requirement, and we have air tightness and vapor requirements. So again, we did a sample window on site. We took the detail with us. We all, we stood around collaboratively, had a discussion. The window supplier was there. The kind of air tightness champion on the contractor side was there. And there was an evolving testing and sampling of how robust we could make that detail, given just the novelness of the detail and where the window had to project in order to be thermal bridge free. So making sure that we can have that engagement, identifying those key details, reviewing that against all the targets that they have anyway. And even from the contractors themselves, they are very keen to avoid material substitution. So we will touch on it in a minute, but if they're told a specification of a material and and if there's competition in that market, fine, they can go and have a look at whether they can substitute something. But really, they don't want to take on that liability. They look for engineering value elsewhere than trying to interfere with the performance-driven parts of that building fabric. In terms of procurement, so they feel quite confident that if we have an enhanced package from the design team, because it is performance driven, they've had to put lots of criteria in and detail into drawings or specifications in order to prove they can deliver that at design stage. That gives them some certainty within their early procurement talks with their supply chain. So it still might require some additional QS resource and understanding of logistics and sequencing, but that's their bit of responsibility to build that in, especially for large complex projects, to make sure that they allow that program time. And again, as a design team or as a client, we can be asking those questions. Maybe these can be turned around and asked as tender questions. How do they understand the need for having some of this information? Sufficiency with materials. So this example here, we developed a bit of sequencing as part of the tender process, but also, if we can get away with a thinner airtightness tape. Airtightness tape is expensive, and there's kilometers of it on certain projects. How efficient or sufficient can we be? And having those early chats, knowing that the contractor's aware of the quality that might be required on site. Maybe they can get away with a 60 mil wide tape and not 120, and they can have those discussions early on. Program planning. So we talked about an early on stage start on site period. So again, when as a design team, we need to engage in that and be encouraging of that and work within that process as well, to save on any kind of issues later on. Air testing in designing for performance is super important, and having a methodology, knowing what you're doing, especially on large scale buildings, is really important for the contractor to have that program in their planning in their program. So it's something that we talk about from the very get-go. So we might not know what the kitchen design is yet, or how it's going to be procured, but we're already talking about air testing and saying how are we dealing with this? Here's a workflow to deal with it. Here's how we think you need to incorporate it in your program. And generally, we do get quite a positive response with that, because you're supporting them, saying, well, look, you might not get the test the first time. How can we support you in that? Do you need to hire a blower door fan so that you can do some localized testing? Can we create a mock-up area in the building within our stage 4 design for perhaps, and allow you to do a small partial test much earlier in the project? Starting that conversation, creating ideas, creating support allows for that to be accommodated. Allowing the right resource, we'll come on to that later on. And importantly, in terms of program planning, what we're finding is having to maybe there's a bit more upfront design cost with contractors' design proposals like CDPs earlier on than contractors might like, and that can be a bit of a change for the supply chain as well. But I think it's really positive if the contractor can allow a little bit of contingency for some upfront design, because it does really help later on, and they will save on efficiency and time later. And of course, their commercial QS at pre-con stage might not be able to identify that formally, but your experienced design manager later on is going to be able to realize that this makes absolute sense. So even within their own teams, that the pre-con teams and the actual design on-site execution guys are having talks early doors. And finally, this is just an example of Agar Grove. There was quite a complex set of flats and maisonettes within the building, 38 units. And because of the complexity, there was seven air test fans needed to carry out the air test for the whole building for Passive House. And there was a lot of pre-planning in terms of how that air would move between party walls that were then filled in later on after that very early test, once we got validation that the contractor was on the right page. So again, we do need to engage early. It's not a case of just setting a target in a brief. We need to be collaborating, helping, thinking about this even in our own design stages to allow the contractor to deliver.
Okay, just
Great,
Anne-Marie, just to let you know, if about 5 minutes, is that okay?
Okay, yeah. So there's different communication workflows that we can look at here for containing and delivering that evidence around performance criteria, and managing on site with different toolbox talks, getting manufacturers in, a no blame culture, etc., is really, really important. And again, this is an example of the Wilmot Dixon and Harris Academy looking at evidencing for Passive House on the first secondary school, where they were able to tag areas that evidence was to be provided, again agreed in a kind of collaborative way with the design team and the certifier, which allowed them to move on through their projects. And then just some examples of evidencing quickly, I'll flick through them. So making sure the insulation that arrives on site is the insulation that's needed, evidencing openable windows for ventilation. So for modeling that as an M&E engineer, actually how realistic is that opening when we take in the reveal requirements around fire and egress, etc., etc. You can see on the image on the right hand side, there's definitely not 100 mil of clear air in our TM54 modeling for this tilt and turn window as an example. And then just looking at quality and workmanship around insulation and what we can accept and not accept. And again, love a good plant room with really well insulated pipe work and duct work, and we can see a really good example here from Harris Academy. And again, if we've specified insulation on MVHR ducts, architects can pick up and observe these things, liaise with their M&E engineers and the contractor, and ask the right questions, even if you're not very sure or understand in detail that type of information in front of you. Changes within the supply chain and substitutions are absolutely fine, but there's modelling outcomes that might need to be tested, whether it's an embodied carbon change or a heat loss change in relation to operational energy, and just establishing that clear workflow and baking into how you move forward in meetings is really important. And this is just another example. We can move from CLT to a complex arrangement by the contractor, which we've discussed earlier, and that can create cost or time or buildability issues that we need to be trying to rectify as we move through the project. And I'll just have a last couple of minutes just talking quickly about the case study and how we applied some of those things across Riverside Primary School. So the design team is there just for you to reference later on, and the client team. A 500 pupil school, £20 million, designed through COVID over an 18-month build period then when we got to site. It was Scotland's first passive house primary school and first steel frame passive house project. Again, contractor inexperienced, design team inexperienced, client inexperienced but ambitious with their climate emergency policies around 2019. And a lot of what we've just talked about was applied from the very get-go with this client, post-Cole reports context as well in 2017, where quality was being criticised across the public sector. Really holistic employer requirements, cost certainty, clash detection, coordination, collaboration, and we were the passive house designer and the architect on the scheme. It was complicated as well. It's a tandem build. There was an operational school on the site, and so there was phasing challenges with that. And there was VE, so unfortunately the project went from CLT to steel frame. And we had a little bit of design change where this clear story was removed, which I think was a little bit of a shame. But we were able to compensate with that with some nice roof lights and the green roof, which again was just covered in PV later on anyway, so it was less of an issue. And again, yeah, just showing the revised massing in relation to the tandem build and existing school that sat behind, with just the nursery needing to be demolished for that period. Design intent for building performance can get delivered through to reality, so we did have to go through a VE process, but we were able to uphold a lot of the low VOC materials we specified and kind of recycled materials. And the in-use performance of this building, we're now at the end of year 2, is down to an EUI of 35 kilowatt hours per metre squared per year. We anticipated a higher EUI. We're quite conservative through the design stage, and the operation of the building, the collaboration of the POE afterwards was just really powerful to deliver 44 in year 1 and 35 in year 2, which kind of goes beyond all net zero and REBA LETI climate targets. The construction strategy was steel frame. It went from CLT, and we think there's increasing complexity with steel frame. I've done a technical position paper on this from the Passive House Trust. Some really useful information in there from the client, the contractor and design team perspective, and the certifier perspective, actually. Really useful to download that. And then there was just various complexities with the steel frame that I moved through in that document, which we don't have time to go through here, and just lots of pros and cons and how we can kind of manage quality on site with steel frame. Sometimes with performance-driven design, there's an anxiety around plant spaces and how big they are. We can see, yes, there's some larger plant spaces in this building, but generally between the heat pump array, ventilation and hot water, we're able to keep the plant sizes and spaces down. And there was a lot of innovation in this project around hot water design. So we really worked collaboratively with the M&E engineer and the certifier to bring down the hot water consumption and losses in the building. And there's been no complaints about that since on the client side. The one thing I just want to pick out from here, which is lessons learned from the client, again, really collaborative client, is that the need for PVs to make targets, we need to be thinking about what that generation actually does. Does it go back into the project or does it not? And they didn't even need the PVs to meet the targets they set around this project for EUI, which is really great. And then just the other thing around oversized incoming loads, I think there's something that we should really reflect on within the contract when we're setting up at the very beginning, asking, are we getting that calculation right? And the standing charges to the client can be quite significant over a period of time. We have embodied carbon targets for the project. Happy to discuss that in the Q&A. I know I'm running out of time. And again, we use a lot of the information you've seen through the presentation already. Site posters, demonstrating awareness, highlighting things. So someone could be having a smoke in the smoking cabin on the site and they were reading about Passive House. Toolbox talks, inspecting sample areas before the contractor moved forward. We're the architect, we're the passive house designer. We do need to come out and review and inspect these things. Lots of clash detection and digitalization on this site, with thanks to Heriot-Watt University for the robot, and just some other feedback. The program was 72 weeks, so only 4 weeks longer than initially anticipated as a non-performance driven design. We had extra 4 weeks added on for the on-site start stage. There's no defects, and it's the first building in 25 years where the local authority hasn't had to go back in the first year to fix a leaky roof, which I just find absolutely appalling that the public sector have spent all the money for the previous 25 years on buildings that had leaky roofs. POE will come back to in more detail in the second session, but we also looked at the overheating resilience of the building as well. And again, any issues that came up in the POE period, we'd already established a really positive relationship with the contractor, the client, and the design team. So things were really easily rectified, and everyone just wanted the building to have these results at the end of year 1 and 2. So just to summarize, Really good insight from this project, which I hopefully have illustrated through the rest of the presentation here. Understanding collaboration, really underpinning all of that. Of course, we want a building to be really well loved. That's what we're doing. We're in the construction industry. We want the building to be popular and invested in and create a kind of good presence within the community. And of course, as architects, we're really proud when a building wins a couple of awards, but it also shows the kind of influence of reach of projects when they're designed to deliver on performance and just how novel it still really is. And then just to kind of come back to this last slide, and again, we can pick it up in the Q&A, we kind of approach projects in a really linear way. And I hope that the presentation has demonstrated that we really need to look at a very cyclical relationship between us. And I know that might affect scopes, expectations, the level of collaboration you might be used to. But it's about relationships at the center of all of this, not the contract, in my belief. And if we can leave the contractual side of things in the filing cabinet or on the digital portal as it is now, we can all work together to deliver really, really good buildings. And Ireland are very well mobilized already to try and equip everybody for that and create those collaborative relationships that we need going forward. So thank you. Sorry if I've run on a little bit.
Just to recap, so you've gone through the responsibilities of the client, the design team, the contractors, etc., and showed the importance of collaboration at an early stage. And that's the key for collaboration, is to start at an early stage and continue through the whole implementation of the buildings to get good quality buildings. I think our next presentation, we're going to start looking at lessons from practice and learning from post-occupancy evaluation, POE. So I'm going to let you take over there, Ann-Marie. Just let everyone know after this, we'll be asking some questions. So if you want to put questions into Q&A, please do so. And hopefully I'll be able to get through as many as possible for Ann-Marie to answer. Thanks, Ann-Marie.
Okay, thank you. Yes, hopefully I'll keep on time this time. Okay, so yeah, and I've seen some really interesting questions, and yeah, we'll have time in the Q&A to pick up some of them. So just running through the topics we're going to go through. So just going back to the basics about what POE is, but I'll call it something else as we move through the presentation, and just benefits, really starting to engage with what are we actually offering as clients or as architects or design teams, what does that actually mean for us? And again, just a little bit of a snapshot, a bit of a pechacucha about what we've learned over about 20 years of doing post-occupancy, and the lessons learned. And again, there's failings as well as the successes in there, and I think it's trying to present that and be aware of that in the right way. So I've already introduced archetype, but I just wanted to bring this graph in. So somebody lovely in the office has gone through 162 of our buildings since archetype was formed 40 years ago and tracked the EUI performance of those buildings. So 40 years ago, it was a little bit light touch kind of we're into natural materials and sustainability, but we don't really know kind of what that is. There was not a lot of guidance or targets or information really out there at all at that stage. It was more like a movement, kind of the passive solar coming out in the 1980s, late 1970s. And as we've moved through time and focused on energy metrics and performance-driven design, we've really driven that down to, well, actually now 35 on our Riverside schools, one of our lowest best energy performing schools that we have. And it's just a really positive pattern. And I guess just as a set of consultants that that's where we're trying to move towards. And it takes time. It's taken 40 years, for us to get there, and maybe the last 15 years to really bring it down to really exciting levels. And there's retrofit and all sorts of other stuff in there. So just being aware of how your buildings are performing, getting that understanding is something I come back to later on. So we hear a couple of terms thrown around about POE, or as I call it, BPE, a building performance evaluation. And I really think we're moving from the post-occupancy monitoring tag to a more holistic tag around building performance evaluation. So there's an out-of-dateness here and a bit of a movement forward where we maybe rebrand or recategorize this into more correct terminology, which is really bringing building performance into everything that we do as architects and designers and contractors. We bring it into what we're actually delivering. So whether that's at the kind of concept and brief stage or the post aftercare monitoring of how the building is performing, it really all starts at the concept stage. to get it right. And I'm not just making this up. This has come from the Methods of Assessment, BS Standard 40101 from 2022, and outlines in detail a lot more information than I'm able to fit in today, but it's a really good reference point for starting off on this journey of knowing more about this and hopefully being able to offer it, or maybe doing a bit of self-exploration on your own existing projects. So what does it really, when we break it really down, what does building performance evaluation really mean? And how are we doing it? Okay, so there's a couple of different headings here. We have qualitative feedback from building performance. So we can do that in a variety of ways with the users, with the client. Maybe it goes back into the site stage with the contractor, in terms of lessons learned, but it's quite subjective and it's quite focused on the experience of the individual. So ensuring that we're able to capture that, because ultimately we're designing buildings or retrofitting them for people to use them. That is the fundamental part of building performance evaluation, as well as the measured metrics. We also want to make sure the building's comfortable, enjoyable, and really suits and meets the brief. We have then observational. So where we might go, or, as a consultant, we might go into a building for a series of days or hours or at key points within that building's operation to look at how it's being used. And again, this can be really interesting work. Like personally, I find this work really exciting because you're really figuring out, is the building performing or failing? And this is a good example of like a little teaching staff kitchen area where, they're their qualitative feedback is that there's no storage, there's no space provision, the storage space has been used for something else, and they're just packing up everything on shelves, and the space itself then becomes non-functional. And so there's this ripple effect where people aren't meeting for coffee or tea because they're taking breaks elsewhere or individually, and you start having a whole kind of shift or unravel in how the premise of that building was meant to be operated. And again, as an architect, I know you can't predict some of this, but actually we can observe and get some of this information to feed into our design, which hopefully the client has done already when they've been establishing their brief, but not always. Quantitative feedback then is probably what the focus of our sessions are over the last couple of days, around getting hard responses through a series of dedicated preset questionnaires, so BISRIA, do a series of really established metric questionnaires, or the building user surveys that are set up as well, have very dedicated sets up as questions and answers and observations from what you put in. And of course then databases. So if we want to benchmark building performance of a building, we can go to CIBSE. We'll have a whole host of different performance benchmarks for all sorts of different stuff, whether it's individual lighting load or overall building performance. We also have observational quantitative parts of the building. And again, this is all building into kind of what the scope is for POE, where we can look at space utilization, and we can tie that into kind of movement surveys, perhaps, of people moving around the buildings. There's all sorts of different ones that we can look at that give us some hard evidence of how a building is behaving. And this is an example I'll come back to later from Plymouth Marjon University. And then, of course, what we're more familiar with hearing about BPE being is energy monitoring and environmental monitoring. And ideally, we have that for a period of time. We can focus on a period, a range of different metrics. So temperature, humidity, CO2. We can also go down into kind of particulate assessment in VOCs, and pick up things around lighting and all sorts of other stuff in that too. And we can access that in person or remotely, depending how much you want to invest in a fancy platform or data loggers. How digital you want to be with it. And we can refer to different reporting methods. So again, how we might report on POE and how we want to present it is all very well established in other guidance documents that I hopefully you can pick up. And this is just an example from one of our schools where we've referenced it against a 1970s naturally ventilated school. It tracked how our buildings were performing over non-passive house and passive house schools over a kind of a period of time. And we can see that the CO2 in the passive house school is a lot more controlled and regulated than in the older 1970s reference building. So this was part of just kind of general self-reflection research, and I'll come on to that in section 4 again. So in the UK in particular, there's an explicit obligation, which I don't believe exists in Ireland yet, and someone can correct me if I'm wrong, of chartered architects to inform clients of the benefits of building performance evaluation. So we're obligated, which I guess isn't a must in terms of contractual language, but it's an obligation there and a kind of duty, I guess, of our service. And the obligation is to offer this as an additional service. So it's kind of written in that this isn't something we provide as part of our overall architectural scope. It's additional element. And there has been a bit of concern around this, from PI insurers and architects, and there's been a couple of different guidance notes, etc., from REBA on this as well, around where people sit. And yes, architects declare, the kind of climate action group call for this to be included in all scopes. We should be doing this as a matter of course. And whilst I also believe that, I think we need to be building up to that. And again, looking at this kind of cyclical representation of how we design and collaborate and bring things together. Every building's strategic definition, the RAI kind of 0-1 stage that you guys would look at is the post-occupancy and the 360 lessons learned should feed into that. So, and we see it all the time. It just doesn't happen. We're not learning the lessons. There's a different client, there's a different contractor, maybe staff changes. How we embed lessons learned in our organizations for everybody to access is still, is a big challenge. And why are we doing it? Well, we've talked about quality and performance gap in the last session. There's a significant performance gap that exists in the industry. And if we are trying to aim for whatever we feel net zero emissions means for us and what that target might mean in the future, a lot of it is related to decarbonising our electricity, of course. But of course, if we're aiming for demand reduction as well, we need to make sure we're also addressing that and we're not just designing buildings with great U values, but maybe terrible air tightness. And we can see from various studies in the UK, especially through housing, that there's 2 to 10%, 2 to 10 times the difference on the operational energy demand. And SIPSI has also come out and said 3 to 5 times overall. Beyond just operational performance, there's lots of performance gaps across different parameters. The other reason is to improve and ensure that the buildings that we get our clients to move into are correct and suitable for building. So the building performance evaluation process starts essentially at commissioning or just before. How is the building going to be operate? What are the controls like? In terms of a full building performance evaluation scope would actually start while we're still on site. And then, making sure that people understand the handover. And again, there was lessons learned on our earlier projects around this. And yeah, finally, learning lessons from design and construction. So, we looked at the opening windows in the last session around how much free air can move around that window and how what we might decide at design stage is very different when it comes to reality. And how then does the user interact with that? Do they really even open the windows that much? And, we can actually create data around window opening as well, depending on what we want. And then I guess the bit that, as architects or designers, we can be kind of excited about or maybe have no interest in. I know plenty of peers who aren't really that interested once they've won all the fancy awards into how the building's actually performing afterwards. And I think that's the greatest failure of architecture, is if the building isn't performing and we don't really know about it or we're not engaging with it. Given the embodied carbon, the investment, the footprint, the physical space that you've taken up with that building. So making sure that we understand that the design intent follows through reality is really important. So I've referred to this already. BS 40101 is going to give you a lot of guidance on this, and I'm just going to give you a bit of an overview about how we've interpreted this standard and how we think it sits in a different series of scope of services. So what we need for building performance evaluation to really work is deciding what type of assessment we want to do. We might want a mix of both here. So we might want qualitative assessment. We might do some workshops. We might not do observation. We might just do a questionnaire, for example. And then we might want to do some quantitative assessment. So energy monitoring, looking at water, for example, and looking at energy use or energy generation on the site. But of course, all of that is underpinned by having all the right building information in the first place. And of course, when we do this on existing buildings, it can be a challenge to obtain all those informations. And we might need to do some existing or additional surveys to get the right information before we start. So we can touch on that again. And again, this is one of the busier surveys for our Enterprise Centre, demonstrating that overall users in the building felt like they were 40% more productive or up in that upper quartile of productivity due to the kind of conditions and internal environment of the building. So building parameters. So I've just chopped this scope down and we'll come back to it in detail in a second. What are we looking for when we say building parameters? And, we send this to clients. We say, right, in order for us to carry out this survey for you, we need this information. Please tick the box whether you have it or not. And if you don't, and we need it, we might need to go for an additional fee or an additional piece of work to ensure we have that information. So like a survey or something like that, especially with existing buildings. And what's really interesting is like the design target. So, you know, we're doing some post-occupancy evaluation in Scotland at the minute of projects that had very allegedly very ambitious climate targets 10, 15 years ago in their time, but actually aren't performing even to those targets at the moment. And going back in forensically to work out what's changed. You know, it might not be the design, it maybe it's the operation or the user. The user experience then, so being able to assess comfort, you know, well-being, those kind of softer qualitative sides can be quantitatively assessed through BISRIA or building user surveys. And then, you know, how the building's used. So if we have a BMS, how are the facilities management engaging with that and ensuring that the building's kind of working? And is there a process for change? Because people change, you know, over 20 years, there could be 5 facilities managers. How does that affect the experience? And then post-construction review. So this is the kind of other interesting bit if we're looking at individual buildings in particular, where we go into the testing of the building. So did we have a test at practical completion for air tightness, for example? Do we have the commissioning information available? What are the acoustic results? A lot of this responds to maybe recently completed buildings where there's a lot of that information available, and having a review of controls. And perhaps at this stage as well, being able to do a thermal imaging survey. So if there's a fabric issue with the building or there's a concern that the building has a lot of heat loss or there's a potential building failure, having these forensic tools available to use is really valuable. And then finally coming down to some of the more typical things we think we do in building performance evaluation, which is around monitoring, and that includes water and overall energy coming in and coming out of site. So how we categorize that. And you've seen that I've just had a level of service across those different parameters as we go through. I'm just going to come back to them now. So, you know, a level 1 light touch, you know, what does that mean for you as a designer or as a client? It's mostly qualitative. So we're looking at occupant user experience. We're not really diving into the detail on the technical. So like air tests or building information, like drawings and kind of how it's performing, maybe not so much, but we can do a little bit of metering and we might look at some external monitoring of um, temperature and seasons and that kind of thing. Level 2 is a bit more standardized. So we do take the building information into this as well. So there mightn't be an air test available, for example. There might be 1 or 2 things still missing from that, but we are looking at metering and looking at more internal condition assessment. This might pick up water use, for example, or it might be to do with kind of breaking down the energy that's used in the building. And then finally, the kind of standard BS 40101 kind of recommended level of performance, building performance evaluation is much more forensic. So it really goes through the detail of how did the building get designed, what were the design intentions, and then how is that executed in reality, tracking physical performance like thermal imaging and air tightness, etc., as well as all the softer bits around the user and the occupant experiences. And again, the quality of that really relies on the quality of the building parameters that you've gotten in the first place. Always on everyone's lips, you know, what does this cost? What's the scale and range of our input as consultants? And again, you know, that really annoying answer is it completely depends on so many other things and what really you're looking for. Because this list in front of us, you could create a totally bespoke list. We've done POE or BPE that's relating to some other areas that are totally different. And you can just see that there's, you know, I've just given some kind of overview here of, you know, the light touch obviously is less expensive, but you know, you're costing in a couple of man days and report writing time. Monitoring then comes into it and assessing what that monitoring means. So the light performance can be over a longer period of time rather than maybe in a lump sum time like level 1 can be. And then the comprehensive investigative work, well, you know, how long is a piece of string? That can go into, you know, a fee, quite a significant fee for adding in services to complete out different elements. Or it can be quite efficient if it's your building and you're doing the post-occupancy on it, or it's a recently completed building and has all the information to hand. That helps mobilize on that one quite quickly. So how have we funded different building performance scopes? Early doors, we've done some self-funding or aligning with PhD students in universities, which is always really great. And there's loads of universities in Ireland that are super interested in all over this, that you could just get it done very economically in that way with some really interesting, supportive academics students. Contract requirements, so just adding it in as an additional contract requirement, whether that's because they need it or because they're looking for enhanced quality. or they're looking at saving and optimization because they're aware that that can happen. It can be part of the contract sum, so like a risk pot or contingency pot, which takes the kind of the adversarial nature of buildings maybe just not being needing tweaking in that first year, where there's a bit of money is put aside that's not defects but separate to dealing with building performance evaluation findings. I talked about the compulsory requirements, Scottish Futures Trust requiring that all educational buildings have a building performance evaluation done to them in order to get the capital drawdown, which I think is really brilliant. You wouldn't pay, you don't give your child pocket money on Sunday to clean their room from Monday for the rest of the week. You give it to them at the end of the week, or you can give it to them iteratively. And it's the kind of same process. We just hand over money without any consequence of how that building is then going to perform with that estate. And then, as part of management budgets, we've just seen as facilities managers on large estates coming to us and saying, look, we really need to just understand this building more. It might not be energy performance driven, but just more user friendly or facilities manager driven before proposing estate interventions. So it is a separate service, but I believe it really can enhance an evidence-based approach for design, performance-based design, allows collaboration to be much easier at the end of projects and during projects, and helps the clients understand their building estate and maybe kind of incite a bit of passion or responsibility in how they are managing that built environment before they actually undertake any capital spend. So it can come out of separate budgets, but really enhance the kind of capital output at the very end. So how have we kind of delivered different scopes? So City of Edinburgh building performance evaluation, 3 different architectural projects, 2-year level 3 scope, excluding thermal imaging or air testing, but included pedagogical observation days, looking at learning and teaching, and actually led to more BPE work, and ultimately Edinburgh deciding on a policy change themselves for new build passive house schools. So, you might think something's kind of a very small piece of a bigger pie, and actually you can have quite a bit of an impact with how you move forward within the processes here. And this was a separate consultancy, but what we used was some of the investigative scope. So we used the existing billing data from the building to verify the PHPP, the passive house modelling, and also looked at opening up an air tests for really understanding the building before we did building intervention. We can also just access data online. So the display energy certificates for all the energy performance of public buildings in the UK are available online. We can quickly create a graph of their performance and demonstrate how a performance-driven targeted building can perform a lot better. With Plymouth Marjan, I mentioned this earlier, we looked at space utilisation surveys and occupant surveys, and essentially concluded with them that they didn't have to extend their campus. They could actually increase their existing floor area by 50% by just utilising the space better, which again is a win-win. You're basically telling a client you don't need to create lots of new buildings. We can do some suitability and remaster planning within your existing estate and free up 50% of the space, which was really brilliant. And then Hawkins Brown, UCL Student Centre, they're looking at tying occupancy monitoring to a visitor's app, which again is another way of digitalizing the whole process of getting feedback on the building. You can develop your own internal internet platform for these things, where you can kind of log all your buildings in one place and kind of access them. And again, depending on the scale of practice and the level of investment you want to put into these things, it's not that expensive to kind of set up, but it's more just the expertise internally to kind of manage and make sure you're linked in the right way. And of course, there's people probably in the room more experienced than I am around AI and innovation and all the other things that we can do in this field to understand our buildings better. So just to kind of wrap up over the next few slides, what other things have we learned from building performance evaluation? So I've just touched on scopes in that last bit and how we kind of approach different projects, but I'm just going to go into learnings here. And we have quite a data bank of buildings now, particularly in primary schools, where we started with some of the technology strategy board funding schools way back in 2010, up to our, the Riverside case study I showed you in the last section, and just various lessons learned around glazing ratios, design, performance, interaction with students, build-ups, all of that stuff has come out in all of that work. So the outcomes of the TSB funding from Staunton and Wye Primary School, it wasn't a passive house school, but it was the best performing building within that school, within the pool of buildings they had at that time. And outcomes of that was that we, every project since, we've started delivering kind of user guides, so that people understand how to work between natural and mechanical ventilation, for example, so there's not this competition or adversarial kind of setup. And also just how some of the performance in some areas, there was air leakage, and the aluminium door in this example was very poor performing. The spec was so much worse than the windows and the frames around it, for example. And just there was lots of kind of design and user lessons learned in the process that helped us bring forward work over our later projects. This indoor air quality study was practice and PhD funded, so in collaboration with UCL, and I was on the very first passive house school. So again, there's lots of lessons learned from those schools, as particularly around indoor air quality, and that's led on to other research around VOCs. And again, it's all kind of funded alongside a university. And just, showing how we've progressed design. And we always come back to these graphs. I think people in the UK must be bored of them, but they're really compelling set of kind of detailed information covering lots of things, demonstrating the different levels of quality of air we can get depending on the energy target that you set. Um, it's interesting when you talk to different audiences, what type of information you're trying to convey. So whilst I love a really complicated graph, it's not really very easy on the eye. And this is one of the schools delivered for the Scottish Government outcomes funding model, where we have to prove the building gets to a LEAP A banding of energy use intensity for 25 years or more. So we're more than under that banding at the moment, which means that year 2 capital funding will be released this year as a kind of payback for the investment by the local authority in that building. And we've just tried to simplify the graphics. So, here's CO2 and here's energy, just presented in a kind of a simple way. And it was shocking that the average energy consumption of all their schools, as a collective average, was over 200 kilowatts per meter squared per annum in comparison to this brand new school. So yeah, just to touch back on Riverside, it performs better than any of the REBA or AI EUI targets for 2030, and also the current net zero carbon building standard in the UK. So it's kind of, I wouldn't say ahead of its time. It's kind of how we should all be designing, but it's and also delivered on a pretty modest tight budget. But yeah, we argue, because there's no evidence to support otherwise, because of our own post-occupancy evaluation that has been independently verified, that it is the best performing school for energy and indoor air quality in Scotland. We can also subcategorize, so we can get energy meters on our services and systems and break down that energy consumption. So again, we need to think about that very early in a design and work with the M&E consultant to make sure that metering is in place for much lower cost, doing it as part of the design than trying to retrofit those types of meters later. And you can see in this example, our heating demand is very, very low in comparison actually to our lighting and kitchen and, server consumption, for example. So, and our hot water, there is a bit of hot water in this diagram that's in the small power. And again, small power and unregulated energy in our buildings is a big challenge within any energy metric or target. So having a good understanding or breakdown of what that is really important. Just arising research out of the more recent passive house schools is significant air quality findings around hazardous exposure levels to different types of particulates and VOCs. And we can see that with again, we were looking at an energy targeted school that focuses on operational energy, but actually also gives an air quality benefit, that we can see, compelling evidence that there's a better performance compared to the business as usual. And again, how post-occupancy is a really important part of that, or building performance evaluation. University of East Anglia, this is, I think, my last example, was a really collaborative project, the Enterprise Centre, with a really, a very ambitious brief, very informed client, and I know, again, I accept all clients aren't this wonderful, of course, but it's always good to have these examples. And we did a soft landings process, which is a very comprehensive building performance evaluation process that's set out very clearly by BISRIA. And there was particular targeted interventions over that time, as well as constant monitoring of energy and lessons learned, which was over a 3-year period initially, but then the university themselves carried that on for another 3 years afterwards. So there's kind of 6 years of data on building performance evaluation, which has made it into various publications that we're achieving, the building was achieving beyond targets without renewable contributions, for example. And again, it's a little bit like Marmite. This building also had a very low embodied carbon target, and we did a kind of patched straw cladding solution for this building, in respect of the thatchers and crafts in kind of eastern England, or in Norwich, kind of repurposing an existing trade, and giving something that's a waste material a new life and a new kind of attention within the university. And of course, we can look back now online and see that for every year since the building was completed, we've achieved the 2050 target. So way back in 2015, this building was already achieving what we've now set as an aspirational net zero carbon target for 2050, which is 60 kilowatt hours per meter squared per year. So again, we can deliver to this level. It became in the median range of cost per metre squared for university development at the time, even with the novel materials and the low embodied carbon. So again, and there was a collaboration piece around VE through that period with the contractor as well. And of course, coming back to why we do this with buildings, like we want to hear from the users and we want to hear that a building is good. And there was some comments in this building about areas that were a bit cold, in the nursery in particular, but the nursery pedagogy in Scotland is around open door policy. And of course, Scotland has a little bit more of a cooler climate. And so if we open a door in any building, eventually the temperature is going to be a little bit different. But we were talking about maybe a 2-degree temperature difference when we then checked it on the monitors. And they're yeah, there's a different perception depending on when different staff are there. But, you know, so there's always a cohort or a space that may need a bit of work or a bit of revisiting. But overall, there's been positive qualitative feedback about the performance of that space. And just to wrap up, there is obviously lots of guidance and literature out there, but I just picked out some of the really kind of important ones that I feel kind of affect this going forward in the UK. Fionn Stevenson's written a really good book around lessons learned and how buildings are performing. And just going back to the really Stuart Brand, How Buildings Learn, you know, this isn't new again. This is something that should be part of our kind of tools for quite a long time. But I guess our contractual context kind of sets us apart from really embracing that. And I think we need to kind of reverse back to that era where we really want to know what happens after a building is built. And then just to wrap up, the benefit of doing building performance evaluation, I hope I've explained that across the slides. And there's just lots of opportunity there for us to improve our design ethos, our service, maybe earn more fee, but also create better evidence-led design and assist in collaboration. So, you know, making sure that early design decisions are done collaboratively based on evidence from previous buildings or similar buildings, and that in delivery, it becomes a tool that we can use to demonstrate why we're doing something, optimize the commissioning process, and make sure the building is well loved. Because that's something that's really important to us in the built environment, as well as you know, the delivery of it as well. And yes, that's all from me. Thank you.
Okay, so we will start. The next presenter here is Nellie Reid. I'll quickly introduce you, Nellie, if that's okay. So Nellie is one of the Ireland's leading sustainability experts, a lead fellow, and a well-accredited professional. Nellie brings decades of international experience from her time with Gensler to her current work advising public and private sector clients in Ireland and in the UK. Her portfolio includes major projects such as Windmill Quarter, Central Plaza, and close to home to me is the Tipperary Civic Offices. Nellie is also a seasoned educator where she has lectured on RIAI Environmental Induction course and has served as a guest lecturer at UCLA, UCD, and TU Dublin. And I suppose you do have something else you want to add on there, Nellie, so I'm going to let you take the lead on that.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Elizabeth.
Okay.
And thank you all for your time today. I hope you find this the dialogue of value to your daily professions. But I do have an announcement this week that Meehan Green has just been acquired by KEO. KEO is an international architecture, engineering, and construction management company based in the Middle East. They have over 2,000 employees, and Meehan Green, although will still operate as Meehan Green in Ireland, but we now are kind of an allied practice with this larger organization, and we'll be doing more work throughout Europe. In the UK, we are opening a Spanish office, and we have a London office now as well. So although I've been primarily focused on the Irish market for the last 10 years, it's now opening up to a broader market, and I'm looking forward to getting different perspectives on how different countries in different regions are approaching the same issues we're dealing with here today. And so I will go ahead and share my screen and we can get going. So here we go. Okay, so what I'm going to be talking about in this session is just how the different building environmental assessment methods relate and tie back to the Design for Performance program. And so it's just to kind of give you an overview of what the different voluntary green building rating systems are that are available to us in Ireland, and also how those voluntary rating systems relate back to regulatory requirements, because I think it's always important to realize that LEED, BREEAM, HPI, these are all voluntary, they're not regulatory. And sometimes those two things get confused. And then also just how the voluntary rating systems, now that there are so many more regulatory requirements, the voluntary rating systems are aligning so that it's more of a seamless, streamlined process, so that as you're approaching design for performance, if you're pursuing a voluntary rating, it will help you meet the regulatory requirements as well. And so just to kind of give some background now, this graph, when I first started this graph, it only had a few logos on it, but over the last few years, so many different programs have come out. And so this representation is meant to be confusing, because this is what we're all dealing with, is all these different programs, certifications, challenges, targets, deals, and it sometimes gets confusing to see like which one of these relates to me. You know, when I start up a new project next week, which one of these certifications or regulations or targets do I need to be focused on? And because of that confusion in the market, that's why the voluntary rating systems have done the work to try to align themselves with the regulations so that there's fewer variables and everything's kind of moving towards the same goal. So the really important goal here is this 55% reduction target by 2030, and we're already in 2025, halfway through 2025. So we have 4.5 years to meet this target, and it's compared to 1990 levels, because that was the last time they had kind of a benchmark to, when the UN set these goals. That was kind of the benchmark they were working against, was the 1990 levels. So all of these things, the Irish Climate Action Plan, the RIAI Climate Challenge, the UN Sustainable Development Goals, the Green Deal, are all aligned with these targets somewhat, although there's little nuances about how do you report and how do you represent that target and what exactly does that mean. The other thing that's important about that is a single attribute target that's just greenhouse gas emissions. And so part of what these different voluntary rating systems and regulations bring in is other metrics like water efficiency, eliminating waste, circular economy, embodied carbon, the indoor environment, materials selection, all of these things, site selection, transport. So it's kind of the GHG emission is one metric, but there's so many other things that fall behind that as well. So just to kind of put this all in perspective with why everything's moving in the same direction now, is it was only in 2015, so it's 10 years ago, that the UN, the countries in the United Nations, agreed to these 17 Sustainable Development Goals. And before that, we didn't really have a set of targets and goals, and these are aspirational. But because all of the countries kind of agreed that this is what we're working towards, that's what's kind of allowed everything to be streamlined and focused on aligning towards these goals. And some of them, even political changes over the last 10 years, have even made me question, like, are we moving in the right direction with these goals? So it's really important that the UN kind of maintain the focus on this and try not to get distracted by individual countries and politics and what different leaders around the world are focusing on, because we can't lose sight of these goals. So in the EU, and you may be familiar with the EU taxonomy, but it was during COVID in 2020 that the EU launched this regulation, which is meant to align with the European Green Deal. So the whole idea was, how are we going to prove that we're making progress towards the EU targets and goals? And so the idea was that there'd be mandatory reporting for companies with more than 500 employees or a certain turnover. You may have read in the news that with the recent omnibus that it's being proposed that there be kind of an easing of the regulations for reporting on EU taxonomy. However, despite the fact that the reporting requirements may be reduced or weakened, a lot of companies are voluntarily pursuing EU taxonomy reporting or aligning their projects with EU taxonomy because it's better for their business and it reduces risk. And that way, when the reporting does become mandatory for them, they've already got their alignment in place. So I'm actually quite optimistic when I see the private sector and the public sector aligning with the EU taxonomy, even though there may be some weakening of the reporting requirements. And so with each of these categories, there's really the mandatory reporting is just climate change mitigation, climate change adaptation. And then the other things are just showing that you meet the minimum safeguards and minimum that you're not doing significant harm with the certain development or activity that you're planning. So these are all happening not at the architect's level, but at your client's level. So the people who are building the building, they're the ones who have to do the EU taxonomy reporting. And so it's just useful to be aware as architects that this is what they're dealing with on their end. And so as we approach this design for performance, it's how can our design kind of help them align with these goals. Then there's also at the same time, in connection with the European Green Deal is the EU Climate Action Law, and which sets these new targets where in 2023, which was 2 years ago, there was 37% less emissions achieved compared to 1990. The target is still that 55 by 2030 and climate neutral by 2050. The Energy Performance of Buildings Directive, you may be familiar with it, but basically what's happening now is that's been recast or updated from the original one. And so instead of the NZEB standard, it's now ZEB, so zero energy buildings by 2030. So the overall target of 55 less emissions by 2030 is for the whole of the EU and within each country. But when we look specifically at buildings, the target is for new buildings to be zero energy buildings by 2030. And that is because buildings, there's actually the technology and the innovation is there for us to do that with our new buildings. So they need to go beyond that 50% emission reduction and go as far as they can go to achieve the zero energy buildings. And then there's minimum performance requirements as well for existing and non-residential buildings. So that's a really important piece of this too, is new buildings only represent 10 to 20% of the industry of the buildings in Ireland. So having those requirements for existing and non-residential buildings is really important as well. We can't ignore the existing building stock. And so the target there obviously is 60% less emissions in the building sector by 2030. So it is more stringent than the overall target of 55. Oh, and also that 60% less emissions is compared to 2015, not 1990. So it's quite aggressive in compared to the overall goal. So building environmental assessment methods, just before we get into the specific ones, they all have the same intent and the same value proposition, which is, setting common benchmarks to align with the regulations. So all the regulations I just talked about, well, how do we benchmark and how do we validate that? And so by pursuing a third-party green building certification, it's recognized in the EU taxonomy and in other reporting such as GRESB. That building certification has value and credibility. So it eases that benchmarking process and also shows transparency, because in the voluntary rating systems, you're disclosing all of this information and being fully transparent on, what materials are going into the building, what's the embodied carbon footprint, how much waste was generated during construction. So the idea that you're opening up your books and saying, well, here's what we're doing, is really important and adds credibility to your green building claims. Stakeholder alignment and trust is really important. If you've got, let's say you're building a new building and you're trying to attract tenants and you have a LEED and a WELL certification or BREEAM and HPI, they're kind of known brands in the industry, so that you can attract potential tenants or occupiers to the building. And there's a competitive advantage, because if you say, well, we've got, this score versus that score, it's kind of an easy metric for people to compare apples to apples, and when they're looking at different buildings in the market. Also for resale value, like if you're selling a building and it's got a rating, it improves the asset value. And that's been shown in studies that buildings with voluntary certifications attract, a higher resale value. And it also avoids stranded assets, where you end up with a building that's maybe 15 years old and underperforming, and it's an energy hog using a lot of energy, and a tenant vacated after a 15-year lease, and you can't get a new tenant in because they say, well, is it BREEAM certified? And if it's not, then, so it can help boost the market competitive advantage if you have that certification. So BREEAM is the first one I want to talk about, and this is, even though BREEAM started in the UK, there is a different BREEAM certification in each country. So it's not a one-stop, it's not a universal certification system. It's customized and based on the building codes in each country. So BREEAM for Ireland is different than BREEAM in India, and it's different than BREEAM in the US. But it is kind of the first, like it was launched in 1992. So it was the first of its kind of this assessment methodology for green buildings. And so that's kind of the important thing, is that it's been around for a long time and kind of set the tone for other green building certifications. And similar to the other rating systems, you'll see they're all rated a certain way, but in BREEAM, based on how many points you get, different levels at different ratings. And there's BREEAM for different project types. So one of the consistent messages here is, with all these rating systems, they have customized versions for refurbishments, existing buildings that are occupied, in use, homes, communities, new construction. The current version of BREEAM, the most heavily weighted category is energy. So that's an important part of this, because it all ties back to that 55% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by 2030. So even though these green building rating systems are looking at other things like pollution, waste, transport, water, energy is consistently the most heavily weighted category. And those are the weightings in Ireland. So as I mentioned, each each country has their own customized version of BREEAM. And then in LEED was launched in the year 2000. So that was 10, 18 years after BREEAM. And the interesting thing is it was someone, Nigel Howard, I think was his name. He was with the BRE and he moved to the United States and was one of the founders of the US Green Building Council, which created the LEED rating system. And so it started in the United States by the US Green Building Council, but very quickly expanded internationally. And when I moved to Ireland in 2011, I was on the international roundtable, which was basically figuring out how to create alternative compliance paths for LEED in Europe. So it was basically looking at what was the normal standard of practice in Ireland and how do we benchmark LEED against the standards in Ireland. So there are kind of slight modifications to the LEED rating system called alternative compliance paths in Europe, and every region kind of has a similar setup like that. But the idea is that it's one rating system with slight modifications for different regions. And in LEED certification, and similar to BREEAM, there's different types of certification. So starting at the top and going down, it kind of starts with just a single building. You've got a new building, a core and shell building or a school or a hospital or a retail facility. Then there's interior design and construction. So it might be a fit out in an office building or a new retail store in a mall. So like even a retailer can pursue LEED certification for their store. And then green building operations and maintenance is existing buildings. So you can go back and recertify a building post-occupancy. The reason I have that in brackets there is that is really where I see a huge market in Ireland, especially in Dublin, with going back to buildings that achieved their LEED certification when they were built, but now they're maybe 5 to 10 years old, and going back and recertifying them and seeing, are they actually performing as predicted in the initial LEED certification, and improving, the performance of all of the existing buildings, and going in and doing deep retrofits of 20 and 30-year-old buildings that might be, the systems are at the end of life and it's time for new M&E systems. And there's also homes and neighborhood development, which gets into neighborhood, and there's also LEED for cities now too. So that's something I've been just kind of teasing out in the market here to see if there's maybe a city in Ireland that would be interested in pursuing LEED for cities. But we take one step at a time here. So the LEED rating system in its current structure, these are the credit categories. You can see similar to BREEAM in LEED, the most heavily weighted category is again energy and atmosphere, which is about emissions and energy use in buildings, and the 4 certification levels there. And so in LEED, there's prerequisites and credits. And the important thing about prerequisites is a building is not eligible for certification unless it meets all of those prerequisites. And so sometimes I have a client who says, oh, well, we're not going to meet the minimum indoor air quality requirement. Is that okay? Do we just not get points in that category? No. If you don't meet a prerequisite, you're not eligible for certification. So there are prerequisites for energy performance, for water, for waste, and also for obviously energy performance and environmental quality. So if those prerequisites are not met, you're not eligible for certification. So just to look at this a different way, looking at it over a project life cycle. So this kind of ties back into the design performance and, early engagement in the process. But LEED, obviously, up until now, the conversation always starts with new buildings or new fit outs. And, there's a lot of LEED new construction buildings in Ireland. but this ARC platform is how LEED for operations and maintenance is benchmarked. Is you basically, anytime you have a LEED certified building, you're automatically entered into this ARC platform, which is managed by the Green Business Certification Institute. And it allows you to input the 4 metrics of water, waste, transport, and energy, and basically looking at, and indoor environment. But looking at the actual 12 months of actual utility bills and post-occupancy surveys. And that's how you get a LEED certification for an existing building. So that certification actually has much more value and is more engaging with the tenants, occupiers of the building, and has a huge value to the owners and asset managers, because through the LEED ARC platform, you are able to see where maybe there's certain systems are underperforming. And so it gives you kind of an idea of where there's room for improvement. And so just to look at these metrics, and they'd be very similar to the design for performance metrics. So you're looking at the energy use, the actual utility bills in the building, the water use, drinking water quality, and also are you using any recycled water, reclaimed water, waste, ongoing waste management, and really eliminating the concept of waste in a building. And then the human experience, doing these post-occupancy surveys and doing testing of indoor air quality for CO2 and total VOCs. And so if you have a BMS system in the building that can track all of these things, that's kind of the ideal scenario, is that all of this information could be, the data could come from the BMS system. And then lastly, the transportation survey. And this is really important too, because part of the carbon footprint of a building is the people getting to and from the building. And so what LEED O&M does is they ask for all of the occupiers of the building, anyone coming to the building, to fill out a survey of how they get to work, how far they come, what mode of transport, and that gets fed into the certification as well. Now, I know we only have a few minutes left here, but I'm just going to kind of sidestep a little bit, because I know we're talking about energy, water, waste, but there's also the people aspect of the building, which does relate to your design for performance program. And it's about the indoor environment and how that impacts people, the occupiers of the building. And so WELL is also managed by the same organization as LEED. It's the GBCI who manages the certification process for both programs. So the idea behind WELL is that the physical environment that you spend the most amount of your time in an office has a huge impact on your overall well-being. So in a way, your facility manager and the building that you work in has more impact on your overall health than regular doctor visits or your genetics or going to the gym after work and your eating behaviors and things like that. So just by sitting in a chair all day, and the way you sit and the ergonomics and the the environment and the exposure to any toxins in your indoor environment can really impact your health. So it's important to equally think about this part of buildings as well. And it's also where people are spending the most money. Like when you build a building, it's a one-time cost. And then you have the cost of operating the building, or rent if you're a tenant, the money you pay in renting the space and utility bills. But with any company, their hugest cost is paying the employees and their benefits. And so if you look at a company's balance sheet, it makes sense, obviously, to invest in the people and reduce turnover and, to be able to attract the best talent. So the WELL certification, the standard came out in 2010, so it's 15 years old. And it has really kind of gone global. Obviously, you can see in the United States is where it initially launched. But all over the world, there are well buildings, and there's 168 well projects in Ireland. So, there isn't a lot. I don't hear a lot in the news about well certification in buildings, but it is kind of a big thing, especially for the multinational companies that are based in Ireland pursuing well certification. A well for all project types and scales. Similar to LEED and BREEAM, there's a well for different building types, and these are the categories that it looks at. And it gets more into mental health and community engagement and acoustics and encouraging movement in the building, encouraging people to use the stairs instead of the elevator, the food offered in the building, access to light and daylight. But then also there's overlaps with LEED in terms of materials, air quality, water quality, thermal comfort. So where there's overlaps between LEED and WELL. What's that? Sorry, is someone speaking? Okay. Hopefully everybody can still hear me. DGNB. DGNB was started in 2007, so it's going back a little bit further. And it was launched in Germany, and it's a second generation assessment method, which means it's the first voluntary green building rating system that came out after there were EU regulations. So BREEAM and LEED came out before there were EU regulations, and DGNB came out after. So it's the first one like fully aligned with EU, the Environmental Performance of Buildings Directives. And it's the first one aligned with the US Sustainable Development Goals, the EU Green Deal, Circular Economy, and the EU Levels Program. It is used internationally, but there are no DGNB certified buildings in Ireland yet. And I'd be interested to know if this may be something for a panel discussion afterwards, but whether there's a market for DGNB in Ireland. And it's come up a few times that because it's so well aligned with EU taxonomy that it might be worth pursuing, but we haven't gone down that road yet. And similarly, in DGNB, you can see the credit categories are very similar, and that it's kind of more of a balance between economic, social, environmental. You can see that the triangle of the ESG comes in all of these certification systems. And then it's also kind of the full life cycle of the project, from planning, construction, operations to end of life. And so again, all of these certifications can be used throughout a building's life cycle. EU levels, just to bring this onto the table here too, was created to kind of help align with the EU taxonomy and the European Performance Buildings Directive. And so this is just another kind of rating system that's EU specific. It's not, it's different than LEED, BREEAM, and WELL, and all these other certifications. It's meant to be kind of a common language for to create indicators to assess office buildings. And so this is also something that probably the Design for Performance program is, I imagine, somewhat aligned with the EU levels to some extent. And then the Home Performance Index is a program that was launched by the Irish Green Building Council. So that's kind of the Irish-based home performance index for residential. And again, this is very much aligned with EU taxonomy and also the EU levels program. So even from a circular economy perspective, like embodied carbon analysis, the LCA model is for HPI is directly related to EU levels. And so with all of these, they follow a similar process from start to finish, but not just start to finish, but then post-occupancy and going back into recertification. So like the representative dotted line there at the bottom is the part that I feel like we're missing. So often in projects, early engagement is so important. So when my company gets contacted to get involved in a project, the project is often already in the middle of a design stage. So it might be in an interim, in design development, or almost going out to tender. It could be like a month before they're going out to tender and they say, oh, we want to pursue a LEED certification. Can you assess our design? And when you get involved in the design stage, it's almost too late, because I'm literally just doing that. I'm assessing it against a benchmark, but not using the rating system to influence the design choices. So really, the best time to get involved is when you're defining the targets and defining the project and pre-planning. So before you go in for planning, if you're going to target a green building certification, that's the time to do it, because it has to be fed into the budget for the project and into the workflow and all the requirements for the architect and the engineer and the landscape, the lighting and the acoustics. All of those consultants, like when you send out an RFP for an architect, you need to say, this is, we're planning to pursue LEED Platinum, WELL Platinum, and they need to price accordingly, and they need to, make sure that they're prepared to deliver the project that meets these targets. And so the problem with coming on in the design stage is the design team's already appointed. They already have set fees. The lead consultant comes on board and there's no budget for the lead consultant, no budget for commissioning or energy modeling. And it's just maybe because of an investor or a potential tenant said, oh, we'll take your building, but only if it's LEED certified, that then the owner says, oh, we need to get a LEED certificate. So we really need to bring that way back to the defining targets and defining the project in order to ensure that there's minimal impact to the cost and the well running of the project design stage and construction, of course. And this lines up very nicely with the design for performance framework, because again, it's laid out and structured here very well, and similarly, so that obviously strategic definition is the most critical point of engagement, and everything kind of flows from there. So I would just emphasize, like, the earlier we can get involved, the better. And then also on the back end, this is where we've, in the last 15 years in Ireland, we've done really well at the middle of this. So we've done really well at, like, okay, achieving green building certifications at design and construction stage, but then everybody walks away. And so going back and doing that post-construction evaluation, post-occupancy evaluations is so important, because it provides feedback on how to, correct anything that's wrong, or how to make additional improvements and improve the performance of the building. What's on the horizon? Just to put a kind of a bigger perspective on this. So we've been talking about green building certifications at the building level, but at the portfolio level, part of what our clients are talking about is, how does my portfolio look. And, when they're doing their annual sustainability report, they want to be able to look at the whole portfolio and benchmark themselves against others. So a lot of clients are pursuing GRES. It's a global real estate sustainable benchmark, and it's for an entire portfolio. And it aligns with the UN Sustainable Development Goals, levels, taxonomy, all of these other reporting mechanisms. And green building certifications tie into that. So, it just shows that the certification process is just part of kind of a bigger picture of what's going on. And really, just to leave it here, is everything that I've just talked about with the green building certifications and the EU regulations. That's all about reducing the negative environmental impact of basically going from really poor performing buildings and sick buildings and buildings that generate a lot of waste. And we're getting to where we have less of a negative environmental impact. But really, what needs to happen next is thinking about how we can have a positive environmental impact, and actually have buildings be contributing to a better environment instead of just less bad. And it is possible. Just to highlight one client of ours, Hibernia Real Estate Group, they've done all of these things. They've done LEED, they've done WELL, they've done GRES reporting, they've done life cycle analysis, embodied carbon, post-occupancy evaluations. They've got bees on the roof. They've got a lot of daylight, and the picture in the bottom is the Windmill Lane Town Hall, which is open to the public, and it's flooded with daylight and a really interesting space. They do a lot to give back to the community. So it is possible to kind of do all of these things if you start early in the process. I'm not going to run through the takeaways because I think we're at the end of time. But these are key takeaways for you guys to kind of have at your fingertips. I'm sure this content will be made available to you after the session. So, these are kind of the good things to, if you're talking to a client, you can use these as talking points. And there's additional resources for everything I've just talked about right there. And thank you.
Okay, lovely. Thank you so much, Nellie. We're going to go to the panel discussion. I know we're 5 minutes late, but so our panelists today are from Pat Barry from IGBC. We have Garode Carville from RIAI, and we have Gary O'Sullivan from SEAI. So just a quick synopsis, what the discussions will be about. There'll be final discussions being together, RIAI, IGBC, SEAI, to reflect on how the design for performance framework can be implemented in practice, what cross-sector collaboration is needed to support uptake, where policy, financing and standards are heading, and what practical next steps professionals and organisations can take. So please put your questions in the Q&A. And I'll be catching up on those. I did see those couple of questions which will be well directed towards Garode, so I will pick up on those. But to begin with, thank you so much, the three of you, for attending this discussion panel. And I'm going to start. I have some preempt questions here, which I've just been busy writing while they've been presenting today. My first question I'm going to send to you, Pat, if that's okay, about IGBC. So you have the membership, which includes the AIB, Ardcan Capital, Home Bonding Finance Ireland, Bank of Ireland, Carrisford Capital, to name but a few. Can you explain the role of these leading financial institutions and investment companies and how they are aligning with the design for performance approach?
Thank you, Liz. Well, I suppose all of the financial institutions are essentially going to be required to decarbonize their portfolios and their loan portfolios over the next number of years. So they're all on a pathway to trying to work with the industry and the construction industry to try and get them to start taking action. So it's interesting. So for example, many of those financial institutions would be lending to home builders, and some of them would be aligning, they would have discounted green loans to enable home builders to, if they build to third-party accredited standards such as the Home Performance Index. And they're even going further now. They've approached us and say, well, we need to get more of the smaller builders on board, building small developments. So can you develop something that's a little bit more user-friendly for those smaller builders? So we started work now on developing entry-level pathways for somebody building 10, 15 homes, because they are under a mandate now to ensure that everybody they're lending to, SMEs, small builders, that they're all starting to get on this pathway to sustainability.
Yeah, exactly. It's a big change, and I think lending financial institutes are a massive part of this. Especially for the smaller projects in particular as well. How do they get started? How do they get foothold into progressing and using design for performance and getting the financial assistance with their projects? Getting green loans and finance is really key to this, especially in the residential, as you know, very much packed with your HPI. So it's a key, I think, yeah. So Gary, I'm going to jump down to you. I'm going to go and look at the sort of policy side of things. You deal a lot with GWP. So how or will GWP calculations place a greater value on retaining existing buildings? We talked about new buildings. Does it apply to existing buildings as well?
Not in the short term, at least not under the EPBD. The EPBD makes it a requirement to produce life cycle global warming calculations for new buildings from the 1st of January 2028, and then for all buildings post 2030. But that said, that the approach and the learnings and the calculation methodology applied to new buildings can certainly be adopted and applied to carry out, I suppose, an assessment of whether it is a more embodied carbon efficient solution to retain and refurbish an existing building as distinct from knocking it down and building a new building. So there's nothing stopping design teams from applying the life cycle global warming calculation methodology to do an evaluation or an appraisal as to what the most carbon efficient solution would be.
And I think when you start setting precedents, you've got examples and case studies, it leads more people into doing exactly that.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Could I jump in there, Elizabeth? I mean, I suppose obviously this is an evolving thing. We're still waiting for the delegated act from the European Union to give further guidance on the requirements for global warming calculation, global warming potential calculation. I just wonder, is it possible that, let's say, I'm just thinking in Irish building regulations, when you do work on a house and you do go beyond a certain percentage of the external envelope, it becomes a major project. And I wonder, is something similar, the similar potential in GWP? So when I have an existing building and I'm extending it or doubling its size, and then the GWP calculation would need to be cognizant of all of the existing materials in the existing building, because they will be part of the new system, and that they will need to be maintained, though that obviously the maintenance mightn't be part of the GWP calculation, but they'll definitely be notionally demolished at the end of life, so they will be part of the stage C. Do you have any notion? Obviously, it's not written, it's not published yet, but do you have any notion of how that'll play out, Gary?
Certainly, the discussions I've had with other people across the European Union is that the next iteration of the recast EPBD will probably address existing buildings and refurbishments. Yeah. Again, we don't have a crystal ball, but that is if you look at the chronology of how they're introducing it. It's like for large buildings, then all buildings. The next logical step will be refurbishments in existing buildings.
Yeah, same process as the BIM mandate. You start big, the precedents, especially with public buildings, and then you filter it through, give time for people to adapt, I suppose. So you can see that national carbon budgets are targets for construction embedded carbon in future climate action plans, I suppose, in this country will be coming forward, and the roadmaps, obviously.
Yeah, well, like under Article 7.5 of the recast EPBD, we as a country need to notify the European Commission of a roadmap detailing limit values, how we're going to achieve limit values, what information we're going to feed into that process, and fundamentally then set limit values for different building typologies by 2030 in terms of embodied carbon.
So Gary, does that mean then at the 2030 stage, we'll have the information in order for the embodied carbon of construction to be incorporated into a climate action plan?
That's the requirement.
Okay, very interesting.
So in the interim, like there is a document there that the European Commission have published outlining a methodology in order to develop that roadmap, and it's going to require there to be a critical mass of life cycle global warming calcs done for our embodied carbon calcs done for a range of different building typologies in order to allow us to establish limit values and set limit values for different building typologies. So there's a significant amount of data to be gathered prior to doing that, and like one of the things that across Europe is problematic, and you spoke about the Delegated Act, and the Delegated Act even the draft of it that we saw last week even introduced additional modules that heretofore, like B3, that heretofore hadn't been considered repair of buildings. It was outside its scope until the last week. Just different member states are assessing different scopes in terms of different modules in the life cycle. Some are assessing just the construction and production of materials scopes. Others are doing the entire life cycle. And so looking at limit values set in one jurisdiction to the other is completely meaningless unless we're comparing like with like, So all the more need to, at an early stage, bed down our range of assessment, or the totality of the scope of the Irish methodology, and then therefore generate a significant library then of examples adhering to that particular methodology, so that we can then decant practical and reasonable limit values come 2030.
Yeah. And there are some good examples across Europe, which I know you're discussing, what they have developed already could be implemented into the Irish framework as well. So,
well, I suppose as part of our development in SEAI on our methodology, like we lent upon the pioneering work that Pat Barry and Stephen Barrett did in the Irish Green Building Council. And then we took that in conjunction with our consultants, and we looked across Europe to see what other member states are doing, and had several stakeholder meetings, or engagement meetings rather, with key people to see what A, they were doing, and B, what was working well, and C, what was going to be the most appropriate approach to develop and move forward with for Ireland.
Yeah. So thank you so much, Gary, for that update. So Garode, I'm gonna call to you. With so many certification systems already in place, like BREEAM, LEED, HPI, etc., why introduce another layer of deep DFP? And where does it fit within the whole realm of things?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I think I suppose the first thing is that these are all commercial standards, and the design performance is not trying to compete with those. It's a methodology that you use for goal setting, role setting, and tracking targets towards verification of performance. in quite a short list of indicators. Do you know operational energy, embodied carbon, water, and IEQ? I mean, if you look at BREEAM and LEED, and you would have seen that slide from Ann-Marie Fallon earlier, where you can just see dozens and dozens of different indicators that are being enumerated and calculated in order to establish where you are on these accreditation schemes, and starting from, you know, geographical location and public transport. So design performance has quite a limited remit, and it's about, I'd say, it's about the framework, stage-based tasks, templates for confirming your targets, templates for agreeing responsibility. So you can use you could use the design performance methodology to actually just for verification of your building regulations. You could use the design performance methodology to approach global warming potential. You could use it for going for the operational targets in the home performance index, or the water use targets in the home performance index. And it's informed by levels, and which we know is obviously levels is the thing, the one ring that's going to rule them all. So levels is bring LEED have just announced that they are upgrading, they're updating their guidance to incorporate the levels strategy, and similarly design performance is also based on that. But so yeah, we were hoping that it's a, I suppose, design performance has no commercial interest. It is meant to be of assistance, and it's not meant to, it's meant to be for all stakeholders in the building industry to engage with.
Yeah, so there's just one little question. It sort of follows in with that from Sarah. Will there be certification for projects that will follow DFP and achieve the same or all of the targets set out in the RIAI Climate Challenge?
Yeah, well, again, this follows from that the challenge is not a standard, and it's not a stick that we're using to beat ourselves up with. It's about goals that are better aligned with the Paris climate targets. It's about so it's a science-based work, and focusing on goals. We know from Irish research, actually there's research throughout Europe, that buildings are not performing. Buildings are consuming, A-rated buildings are consuming more energy than the building energy rating is suggesting. In fact, A-rating buildings consume 20% more energy on average when plug loads have been allowed for. So we know there's a performance gap there, and this is about, you know, and the performance gap isn't consistent throughout all schemes. You'll find passive house actually tend to perform exactly as they're designed. So the performance gap is there's again, the design performance is about stage-based, task-orientated goal setting, tracking targets to enable design teams to deliver better, more accurate and representative.
Yeah, and I suppose, you know, behavior comes into that. You know, I do know people in amazing houses and they're just using it incorrectly. So the POE, you know, performance occupation evaluate is really important. I think that's an important step to keep this cycle going rather than, you know, losing track of how the building should be used. So
yeah, I think we've seen a number of speakers bring that up. Like I know Archie O'Donnell talked about it in terms of it even more relevant when you get to a bigger scheme, you know, to a bigger building.
Yeah,
This facilities management, etc.
Yeah. So just a question really on the document itself. What advice would you give to someone who's looking at this document? Because it's a big document, it's 100 pages or so. You know, do they have to read the whole lot? Where do they start? You know, can they read parts of it? Especially, you know, if you're looking at the smaller projects. What advice would you give on that?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that you start with the one thing that you're the most familiar with. You might be operational energy. You think, okay, well, that's something I can understand. I'm working on it all the time. And then you might find that there's only 2 or 3 points where you go, oh, actually, that would be useful. You know, maybe we do a B or a calculation early in the design process, and we understand what the variables in that are. things like that. So that early stage engagement, you don't try and digest the whole thing. I say just pick one indicator and focus on that, and thread it through your work, and then use the learnings from that in order to inform the next project. So that feedback loop, use that in order to build out your work and your expertise in this area.
Yeah. I suppose there's this question. I think this was from last week's session, this question, but if performance occupation evaluation is additional work, does it exist in any of the current RIAI client architecture agreements, and are there issues with liability? How do we deal with them?
So POE doesn't exist currently in any of the client architect agreements. Okay, and it's Marches Ireland who are the RIAI PI. The Marsh Ireland are the brokers that the RIAI work with, and so their advice is that where architects are doing services, engaging in services that are not described in the existing contract, then those services should be agreed in writing. I'm going to say that's common sense. And by doing so, you're also addressing the fact that it's additional work. And so you should be in a position to discuss with the client whether, to what extent those hours and to what extent they should be paid for. The other thing that Marsh Ireland do suggest is that where you are engaging with in a contract that isn't outside the existing suite of contracts, that you advise your insurance broker. But there's very little, they have very little to say about it after that, in terms of there is very little, there's no very few claims or known claims in relation to POE. There's no case law in relation to POE. So there's no one's at the moment. There isn't this great risk that the fear that people might have, as expressed through Ann-Marie's discussion earlier with the relationship with the M&E on that project. So, but yeah, so if you're doing work, you should agree it in writing, and that's common sense.
Yeah. I suppose there's one question here from Grace. It could go to Pat or yourself, Reid. So many of the public bodies focus on energy efficient design methodologies, such as the HSC, use Ireland, Aaron, etc. How do we change this mindset to move to design for performance? You're both involved in this from the start, I suppose. So let's Pat have a go to give you a rest there, Reid, I think.
Well, I don't think there's any contradiction between their methodologies, because my understanding is they're also looking for performance. So they're completely compatible. It's the same approach of starting early, setting, as far as I understand, it's about setting goals from the beginning prior to starting the project, following those through, reporting at each stage, just ensuring you're on track, working cross-disciplinary. It's not the linear thing of, the architect does the concept design or detail design and then passes it over and has all the problems fixed in it. It's about integrated design team working, where you're working with the engineer, you're working with the structural engineer, and you're all collaborating on achieving the same goal. You're not doing things separately. You're not trying to fix each other's problems. You're working to the same common solution, or the same common goal, and you're working collaboratively to find solutions to meet that goal.
Yeah, but I suppose the DFP goes slightly beyond the EED methodologies. It brings a whole cycle around. So I suppose they're asking, how do you persuade them to move that a little bit further?
Well, I think it's essential that there's always goal setting at every project, that every project has that we need to convince all procurers to have goals at the start of a project. There's a very good example of this. The GTA did this in Grange Gorman, where we worked with them on a competition brief for one of the buildings in Grange Gorman, where we sat down with them and said, okay, well, how do we integrate whole life carbon, and how do we set goals? So they integrated a goal, and this is maybe 4 or 5 years ago, before we had really good benchmarks. And it's not that you have to have an absolute fixed contractual goal, but we said, okay, well, we can take the Letty numbers and we can use that as a number that we can all work to. It may not be the right number, but if we can work to that number for whole life carbon at the start, that'll inform how the design team work throughout the various stages. So a conceptual design, we'll track it, we'll see what we have to do. You know, it may not even be possible at stage 2, but at least you have a baseline that you're working towards, and that just animates everybody to work collaboratively. So it is possible, and we can persuade them and to do that, because it's such a sensible way of working.
Yeah, I suppose key, especially, is communication and collaboration. You know, it's getting the two together, explaining to people, well, this is the way you should be going. You know, this is not necessarily what you need to, it is what you need to do, but it's persuading them and showing them all the benefits. And if there are case studies and precedents already set, it's easier to explain and persuade. So it's great to see these. I mean, Grange Gordon is a perfect example that you just explained. So this sort of leads to a question for you again, Pat, is you also, collaboration is a key ask of design performance projects. The IGPC have worked with Irish architects on design performance and the SCSI on ENACT, which is enabling commercial retrofits. You host working groups involving all the professional bodies where they share knowledge and training opportunities. So what next? You know, do we all need, in terms of collaboration, what do we need next between cross-professional collaboration to Main Street performance-based practice? What is next? You're in the thick of it all. You know, you push a lot of the agenda in Ireland and fairness. So, what might work if we want to progress this further?
Well, I suppose you mentioned some of the things that we can do. I mean, as the Irish Green Building Council, we've 450 members, corporate members, but we know most of the construction sector is SMEs, small, medium, 1-2 person practices. So if we want to reach everybody, it means all of the professional bodies have to collaborate. And the only way we're going to get this out there is if we're collaborating with the professional institutes. So the deeper that collaboration is, so for example, rather than us all developing separate courses, if we do exactly what the RAI are doing here, is developing a course that's open to all of the professional institutes. If we can extend that approach across all of the professions, I think we can move a bit faster. And the importance of developing more of that interdisciplinary, call it integrated design team working, the better, and stop seeing ourselves as, each controlling a piece of territory, and see us each collaborating to actually achieve a common goal. I think that's what we need to do.
Yeah. I suppose, I'm going to ask Reid the sort of, similar question. What's next step should we do to encourage everyone to move forward in their practices or organisation?
So I think there's great awareness. Certainly, the great awareness amongst practitioners of the need to upskill. Okay, and I don't think you can move forward without some additional training, without some additional professional development. There's extraordinary wealth of opportunity through the third level institutions, such as TUS, through the DASB program, through micro-credentials, through Technical University Dublin in their building performance course, through master's programs in UCD. So there's great opportunities there. A starting point also available to the RAI members is our environmental induction course, which we had our first iteration of recently, which was very well received, and that leads to an environmental accreditation. But we are considering that as a starting point towards further upskilling. Obviously, I should also mention the Irish Green Building Council have tremendous resources and training, very micro sort of learning opportunities on their website on water, on whole life carbon, and this is what we need is for members and all building professionals, all stakeholders in the industry, and from tradesmen up to sort of engage in this, so we can deliver better buildings.
Yeah, I suppose all professional bodies, they've all got their own equivalent of the environmental aimed specifically at the trade. So building surveyors, engineers Ireland, even CAAT, in CABE, they all have their own CPDs. And many of the higher education, we are feeding them through professional bodies because, as you know, I'm from TUS. So to get CPD certs. So linking them all together, and we work very closely with IGBC as well. They have a wealth of short little webinars to almost give you a taster, but make you start thinking. And that leads you then into doing upskilling, which is what we all need to do. So, yeah, I mean, from your perspective, Gary, what do you see as the next step for people with, in organizations, or even for people themselves?
Well, definitely upskilling, but like the key message, I think that's been said by the previous speaker was early engagement. Like, you make the most impactful decisions on a project at conceptual stage, and therein after the ability to change the trajectory or the course of the final result diminishes. So early engagement, I think, is the key thing that we've seen from our side. Do something.
Yeah, exactly. And there is the SEAI and Energy Link as well. So if you're in the public body, work in that area, there's lots of short trainings there as well. So link up on that as well. There's so much out there. It's bringing it all together. So unless anybody wants to say any last words, we will close the discussion panel, and we will go and share. Thank you so much, Gary, Pat, and Reid, for your insights. It's been really handy. I see Ginlan is back, so I'll let you share the poll then, Ginlan, seeing that you're